Okay, this is a recording of Culture Script 2. In the study guide, it begins on a page about 19, and you can open the study guide and read along with the video if you like. Now, in all of these models that I'm presenting, all 8 of the domains and the other things, I'm not developing them extensively. That would take longer than most average readers would have the patience for. I tend this to be what in college they call a survey course, introducing you to and describing for you things that might be worthwhile for you to study in depth on your own. That's why this document is titled A Study Guide. Because you'll probably be creating targeted, tailor-made interventions aimed at a much smaller audience, 1 or 2, or at most just a few of those closest to you. That's the beauty of the life right now. We have a world of research materials at our fingertips, so you can find what you need to customize your efforts. In a short time, you should know enough to be able to select for further development and study those materials that offer the best promise of helping you address problems and challenges that are specific to your situation. Later, we'll introduce the idea of operating in your own domain or dominion, where you have the most influence. So we're trying to equip you with some broad, general tools that can still be quite specific when you analyze them down and apply them to your targeted intervention. I'm saying I think I've laid enough of a foundation for us now to proceed to look at the first models of how humans develop and live. Culture will be our first consideration because it is so all-encompassing that everything else we want to consider is subsumed within our culture. However, when I actually started making videos, I did not start with culture. I've put up about 13 videos, and I'm just now coming to the point where I'm going to deal with Hall and Smith, Stanley, and Shores, Young and Morgan, and their models of culture. As you sample these videos, you'll be able to skip back and forth and find those things which are most useful to you. But I felt in the end I needed to lay a better foundation of what these models and their importance is built upon, so I think I've done that. Now, referring to my notes, my early quest for understanding, I mentioned this in the beginning of the study guide when I was a caseworker in Blanding. A young man hung himself with barbed wire rather than go back to Intermountain Indian School. It says, after the young man's death by hanging, I determined to discover what I could about culture. You see, I was just telling one of my children the other night, I thought as a caseworker I was doing a great service. I really believed that if all the young people on the reservation could get an education, that would solve all of the problems. I thought education and culture were just very pure. But I learned, beginning at this very painful example, our culture is loaded with cultural elements that are not just straightforward. The patterns in our culture are open to determination and definition, and we as a group agree that certain things are as they appear to be. And it's so interesting that another culture may see the exact same things and put a different interpretation on their meaning. And so that's what we're dealing with here, is to understand culture so that we can analyze it between societies, but also between families, institutions, husband and wife, just any number of ways to exercise these tools. But I wanted to learn what I could about culture. I began by taking stock, roughly because of my inexperience at the time, of my tools and resources for the task. I felt I had some tools to aid my search for understanding. I spoke the Navajo language and had acculturated enough to be accepted as a member of a Navajo clan. I had clan brothers, clan sisters, and when I entered into the Navajo culture, I was what I called invisible. I didn't make waves. I didn't irritate anybody with my Anglo ways. I was able just to slip behind the cultural screen and practically be a member of that culture and society. I had a college degree in history and teaching credentials, 3 years teaching in an Anglo junior high in Pocatello, Idaho, 3 years training and work as a welfare caseworker for the state of Utah with 120 Navajo families to watch over. I also trained in the Army to be a military policeman. In my early 20s, I spent 2.5 years on the Navajo reservation as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. While in southern Utah, I served a 1-year mission under the direction of the local church authorities. In total, I've served 5 missions. A little bit later, somewhere I say that because I absorbed both cultures and wasn't totally comfortable in either one, I was looked at as a little strange. And so often the people around me would say, well, what do we do with Brother Hansen? Somebody would speak up and say, well, let's send him on a mission. So I served a total of 5 missions in my career, many of them with Indian people, all the way from Pocatello, Idaho to northern New Mexico, and with the Ute tribe out in eastern Utah. So I had this broad eclectic experience, a lot of raw material. I think nowadays they call it a cultural immersion experience. I was also working as a part-time, fully authorized police officer in southern Utah. I was having a lot of experiences on several levels, and I had a native curiosity about how these things work in the world, especially the development of the human mind. How did we acquire this culture? And what part did our mind play in it? And if any or not, could we be totally without culture and still get by, and so on? So I had a lot of questions. I was accepted into a Navajo clan and thereby passed through the usual defense barriers, and it was one of the most precious gifts I have ever received when those people began to accept me that way. Now, moving on, the Navajo have an interesting question they sometimes ask. Where were you when your mind came into being? In parentheses, we would say when you first became aware of yourself as a human being. It fascinates me that the Book of Mormon, the record of the Native American people, has this message, 3 Nephi 1 and 27. And there was also a cause of much sorrow among the Lamanites. For behold, they had many children who did grow up and began to wax strong in years, and they became for themselves, and were led away by some who were Zoramites, by their lying and their flattering words, to join those Gadianton robbers. And thus were the Lamanites afflicted also, and began to decrease as to their faith and righteousness, because of the wickedness of the rising generation. So we weren't the only ones losing our posterity to Gadianton robbers. The problem's been around a long, long time. It's no small thing when they say, in order for progress to be made, 2 generations must agree. And that is one of the pillars of our study of this material. How do we bring that to pass? While still respecting the zone of personal dominion, which means that the mind is encapsulated behind a barrier and nothing enters in that person does not choose to allow to come in. How do you kind of pry it open and get information in there, so on. And further along in this chapter, we'll talk about the doctrines of the apostates and what can be done about them. When I examined myself around this idea of what resources I had to guide my journey, I found I had internalized, to the level that I thought primarily in one language or the other, depending on what was being demanded of me by the culture I was in at the time. Portions of two powerful cultures, whose manner of presenting the surrounding world to me offered almost diametrically opposed explanations of the external realities I experienced. We call them cultural patterns, and they will be explained a little further along. This capacity offered expanded tools for deeper analysis of what culture is and how it affects how we see, experience, and think about the world around us. More technically, how we organize the data that comes to us through our senses and how it helps us give meaning to that stream of information. So we're sort of rounding out here by feel the definition of culture. It has been said that our culture is our window on the world. I had two of them, and as Hall says below, and as Chester Nez observed, it's hard to accommodate these two particular realities. I suspect that we now have many returned missionaries who've had similar experiences, accommodating two different cultures. And so we're prepared to understand what we are discussing in Hall, the Silent Language, where he says some languages and cultures are so dissimilar, English and Navajo, for example, that they force the speaker into two different images of reality. And it's just very interesting to me that Edward Hall focused on the Navajo people and studying them. We get into Feuerstein, even though he started out in Israel, later on in his career he came to the Navajo reservation and worked intensely with the tribe trying to implement his programs too. And so I sort of felt like, gee, I've got this from two different directions. Here are two of the scholars that are trying to deal with a very complex culture, which I happen to be pretty well acquainted with. And so I had these two tools of analysis, an Anglo mind and a Navajo mind. And I will confess, and anyone who knows me will tell you, I didn't do too well in either one of them. I seemed to have a lot of trouble finding myself and presenting myself in ways that were acceptable in the two cultures. And as you read this material, you'll find that this is one of the main problems that younger people have, especially among the Navajo people. They call them the people between because they seem to be trapped between two opposing cultures. And I'll give some examples of how that would work in daily life here after a while. Moving on, I learned much of the Navajo language I knew in the 1950s, that is, the last century 1950s, from the parents and grandparents of the Code Talker generation. Their memories went back to those who took or avoided the long walk under Kit Carson in the 1860s. Now, if you studied the history of the Navajo Nation, superficially, you would hear that Kit Carson came in and blocked off the mouth of Canyon de Chelly, burned out all their orchards, killed all their livestock, and forced them to gather at Fort Defiance and then walk off to be incarcerated in I believe it was Fort Sumner, for quite a while. But in fact, there were a lot of Navajo people who didn't go. They just simply hid out. The cavalry couldn't find them. And so they were still there on their reservation while the main body of the tribe was in captivity. Anyway, I learned a version of the Navajo language that was quite old and rich. Later, young people told me I talked Navajo like their grandfather used to. Thus, I internalized, and as best I could, two cultures as represented by their languages and their practices. People will tell you, as I mentioned still today, at age 84, I'm still a little peculiar as Anglos go. I never did outgrow the cultural personality I developed among the Navajo. My clan sister would say that when they dropped me down, they just forgot to paint me brown, otherwise I was Indian. I don't want to get maudlin here, but my whole adult life I've filled out of step with my mother culture and with the Navajo culture too, because I wasn't about to abandon my mother culture and my position in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I know how it feels to be a person between, as the Navajo people say, of those who haven't really acculturated fully in either culture. I was very interested when I ran across Feuerstein's work, because though he was working primarily in Israel at first, he also studied and worked extensively with the Navajo. And I'm sorry, as I mentioned before, I have emphysema, and on occasion I have to stop and clear my lungs. He also studied and worked extensively with the Navajo, and the thrust of his work is to give the people between a strong cultural basis upon which they can rebuild their lives. His organization is still very active, so your Google and Thumb will find him quickly. Why do we study this? It offers a case study that introduces many of the issues we must consider in an arena that I'm familiar with, so I can better conduct this initial discussion. Bear with me, please. I'm not a rocket scientist, and I'm really struggling to present all of this in a rational, logical sequence. Later, when you begin to see just how much there is to be known about all this, you will understand better my challenges here, and hopefully sympathize with my struggles at communication. Okay, we'll consider 3 models that purport to describe culture. Each succeeding model is more complex than the previous one, and therefore is more useful to us. Now, when I was teaching VISTA volunteers and other people and had to introduce them to the idea of culture, I always started with these 3 models. And it just, because the first one is relatively simple, straightforward, easy to understand, it sort of gives you some hooks to hang the other models on as you dive deeper and analyze further. Now, the first model was described by Young and Morgan. These men worked for the federal government in the 1940s. They wrote the first Navajo language dictionary, written in characters that were found on a regular typewriter. It is the same dictionary published now by the Deseret Book and used by missionaries of the LDS Church for many years. I happen to have a copy of the original of this work, and I value it highly. Young was a linguist, Morgan was a skilled Navajo interpreter, and they made a great team. They later wrote a treatise to help those struggling with the language and to understand why the Navajo people were not adopting the dominant Anglo culture in droves, as any right-thinking person from the Anglo viewpoint should be absolutely eager to do. If you want another viewpoint on this cultural conflict, there's a marvelous book out that they made a movie of too. It's called The Ugly American, and it tells about the diplomatic service and what some of the Americans assumed about the people they were there to help and so on. It gives you a good perspective of all this. They said that all cultural elements, the parts that go to make up a culture, can be divided into 2 major groups, material and non-material. Material items of culture are straightforward, mostly things that can be seen and handled. Their utility, that is, their usefulness, is easy to demonstrate because there's a one-to-one correspondence between the item and its usefulness. In the early days of Native American contact with the Europeans and Americans, steel axes, guns, cooking pots, blankets, and some clothing, many other items transferred readily from one culture to the other because it was easy to demonstrate their usefulness and their superiority to what they were using. As time went on, trucks, wagons, horses, and all manner of tangible things made their way into the Indian culture without changing their non-material culture much at all. And you'll find the beginning of that on page 25 in the PDF copy of the study guide. They still spoke their same language or spoke English with Navajo language syntax. We'll consider an example of this when we get into the intervention called Put on the Whole Armor of God. Anyway, non-material items of culture. How do you demonstrate that your child-rearing practices are superior to theirs? Chester Nez gave you some input on that. Or how do you care for the elderly? Nutrition, discipline, social controls over behavior. What's acceptable and what isn't? Courtship, marriage, beliefs about spiritual matters, stories of creation, living with a wife and family, employment, study, arts, music, the meaning of life, and so on. These cultural elements are mostly made of intangibles and abstractions that have to be held and examined as ideas in the mind. Unfortunately, most cultures, and especially in the Anglo culture, these things are modeled informally with very little explanation. We just absorb it by imitation or mimicry out of the cultural air that surrounds us from birth. We aren't explicitly aware of these unspoken mores, rules, values, and so on, but we feel uncomfortable when they're violated, even though we can't say why. It's difficult to demonstrate the utility of these things or show how your cultural element is somehow superior to theirs. And I've had deeply personal experience with this. I served as a cross-cultural interpreter with both the Navajo people and the Utah Utes. The Navajos sent me to Washington, D.C. 5 times to negotiate grants and contracts and get them into a form where, when we got them back to the reservation, they actually did some good and addressed the very real problems that our board of directors were struggling with, like Head Start and what later became the WIC program and those sorts of things. And so they would send me to Washington to explain to what they called the crazy white man what Indians wanted and needed and why. Then I'd come back to the reservation in a board meeting with deeply acculturated Diné. I would try to explain the Anglo programs and how the Navajo people could achieve what they wanted in spite of the rules and guidelines that the federal government kept wanting to implement. I was heard to remark more than once I could sit down at a conference table and in 15 minutes have both sides mad at me. Nevertheless, because of my background in languages and my studies in culture, I was able to make positive contributions to bringing the two sides together. So, how do you demonstrate that your child-rearing practices are superior to theirs? Chester Nez gave you some insight on that. How do you care for the elder, nutrition, courtship, and so on? These cultural elements, mostly made of intangibles and abstractions, that have to be held and examined as ideas in the mind. Unfortunately, in most cultures, and especially in the Anglo culture, these things are modeled informally, that is, non-verbally, with very little explanation. We just absorb it by imitation or mimicry, and we aren't explicitly aware of the unspoken mores, rules, values, but we feel uncomfortable when they're violated even though we can't say why. It's very difficult to demonstrate the usefulness of these things or to show how your cultural element is somehow superior to theirs. Now, as you read this, perhaps it'll begin to filter into your minds that this is the problem with a young person or an immature adult who's alienated from the church culture. They don't see the utility. Now you, as a master interventionist, need to know how to manage the cultural elements of the culture there. This is an addendum to Cultural Script 2. The other tape ended and hadn't quite finished the material, so I want to make this and attach it onto the end of it. Now it says this applies to major cultures. And what we're talking about is it's hard to demonstrate the utility or usefulness of a cultural element to show your cultural element is somehow superior to theirs, to the people that you're working with. This will be so very true when you start working with people who disbelieve, because they aren't existing in a vacuum. They have an entire belief system that supports them in disbelieving. And so somehow you're going to have to demonstrate that the elements of the culture of godliness are better, superior. And that's the whole purpose in studying these interventions, to learn how to craft what you're going to say ahead of time, the kind of things you can take into account when you're crafting that intervention. So anyway, the stating here is this applies to major cultures like the Navajo and the American. But at other levels of analysis, it can be an issue between husband and wife, parent and child. My mother certainly didn't do it that way, they say. We're constantly negotiating and compromising the patterns we use to understand our world. As, for example, the social moral certainties of the past are eroding to the point that it's often difficult now to reach consensus on many things in our values system. And with the founding of America, we had a work ethic and a number of other things that were just universals. Practically every adult knew about it and could do it, but we certainly don't have that sort of culture anymore. Our study of these models can greatly deepen your understanding and appreciation for what's involved in trying to live our lives with meaning and joy. We can also get insights into the challenges of setting up nurturing environments for maturing minds and remedial interventions for those who have not adopted the culture of godliness as their life plan. They may have a mature mind-brain complex, but it hasn't been articulated or animated with these cultural elements. These tools of cultural analysis and understanding can be used widely and can be very productive in helping the creation of guided interventions and guided re-intervention on the part of your learner. And they prepare our minds to benefit from Burns' discussion on the actual organization of the human mind and how it is influenced by cultural elements. So you're going to be able to analyze right down to the very basic level of human culture, society, how our minds are organized, and what effect and impact these various things can have. And to understand about how remedial efforts can be designed for specific problems and specific people. Now, I'm making the statement here that we won't spend a lot of time with this model of culture because the others are so much more powerful in describing the world we live in today. But as you will see in Syllabus 2, material and non-material concepts translate directly into Fisher's model
of concrete and abstract thinking skills. This material can help you analyze and characterize the thinking capacity of your learner. So it says, see page 14 under Put on the Whole Armor of God, Syllabus 2, What Can Go Wrong? And it cites that as page 27 in the PDF. But don't be afraid to use your little search engine in your PDF and plug in the Whole Armor of God and Syllabus 2 and so on, and find those things and really give them a good going over. Now, this will be the end of the addendum to this script, and so we'll stop here. Thank you for being with me.